15 Commander Jim Lovell has more time and space, almost 24 days already, than any other man. And I asked him recently if he ever was scared.
Oh, well, I've had an engine flame out a few times at an aircraft and was kind of curious as to whether it was going to light up again, things of that nature. But they seem to work out.
Is there a specific instance in an airplane emergency when you can recall fear?
Well, I tell you, I remember this one time. I'm in a Banshee at night in combat conditions, so there's no running lights on the carrier. It was a Shangri-La. We were in the Sea of Japan, and my radar had jammed, and my homing signal was gone because somebody in Japan was actually using the same frequency, and so it was leading me away from where I was supposed to be. And I'm looking down at a big black ocean, so I flip on my map light, and then suddenly, zap, everything shorts out right there in my cockpit. All my instruments are gone, my lights are gone, and I can't even tell now what my altitude is. I know I'm running out of fuel, so I'm thinking about ditching in the ocean. And I look down there, and then in the darkness, there's this green trail. It's like a long carpet that's just laid out right beneath me, and it was the algae, right? It was that phosphorescent stuff that gets churned up in the wake of a big ship, and it was just leading me home. And now, if my cockpit lights hadn't shorted out, there's no way I'd have ever been able to see that. So, you never know what events are going to transpire to get you home.
Good morning again, everyone. Good morning. Here, that was a scene from the movie Apollo 13. I'm sure that many of you have seen it, or if you haven't seen it, some of us certainly remember it actually happening. Was it like 1972, I think, when all of this happened? Something like that. And of course, he's referring to a time when he was over the ocean and everything just sort of gives out and it looks like all hope is lost. And the strangest of things happens and he sees something in the dark that he can't see in the light, and it leads him home. Have any of you ever experienced this? I have on a very small scale. I've not seen it behind a ship, this phosphorescence, but when I've been diving in the Caribbean, I go on a night dive, and we all agree at some point to turn off our lights, our flashlights. Where normally you could see the critters and everything else, but if you turn them off, and you'll see in the flick of your fins, you'll see these little green flicks, just little bits of light. And that's on a very small scale, but behind a big ship, as Tom Hanks, Jim Lovell points out, it's a big green carpet, but it's so dim that you can't see it if there's any other light around. And you know, I thought about that as I thought about what I was going to say to you today and the lesson that was just read to you. I want to go back to the very beginning of this series, the Exodus Road Home, because when we first started this series, we were talking about what is our purpose in life. And, you know, it's not always apparent. In fact, most of the time it's not apparent at all. Sometimes you think you have a bead on things. You think you know why you're here, what you're doing, and what your purpose is in life, only to find out that what you thought was purpose was really not purpose at all. But there was something larger and wider and deeper, a meaning to your life that you had no idea was out there. So if you remember right, one of the first stories that we looked at was the story of Moses' birth. And just before that, how the Pharaoh has commanded that all of these Hebrew children, these boys, were to be murdered. And there were these two midwives. And they thought they had a purpose in life. They knew what they were about. They were on this earth to bring children into the world, just simply to help mothers give birth. And you know, it's something that's been going on for centuries, centuries before them, centuries after them. It's a common job, it's an ordinary job, and frankly, it's not very noteworthy. But these two women see an injustice. And they see their leader, who is driven by paranoia to become bloodthirsty. and they saved the babies. And you know, they had no idea, but in the process also saved Moses. And in saving Moses, they save a people from slavery into freedom. That freedom wouldn't exist without them. And you know something else? We are the children of those slaves. Children not by birth, but by faith. And without them, we wouldn't be sitting here either. See, they thought they knew their purpose. They're bringing babies into the world. But in that purpose, something larger emerges. Sometimes it happens that way, right? Sometimes it happens in other ways, like the Jim Lovell story. You know, you think the world has just gone into the toilet, and you have no idea why these things are happening to you, and it feels as if they are set against you. And why is this happening? Why am I suffering? Why is this thing coming at me that is just drawing a negative over my life? And like Jim Lovell, sitting in the cockpit, the lights go out, and he sees in the darkness a greater purpose for what's happening, something that he couldn't possibly see in the light. So I'd like you to hold that thought as we sing, and we will come back to this in just a bit. So chapter 34, the lesson that you just heard, it's a story of Moses coming among the people and his face is shining, right? And he has to veil his face. But let me just give you a little bit of background in terms of what's happening here. So the beginning of chapter 34, Moses is on the mountain with God. And God gives him some commands. He says, fashion a couple of tablets, stone tablets for me, and I will write my commandments on them. And then he also gives Moses some other instructions. He says, when you go back down to the people, tell them, don't make treaties with other countries. Don't fall into the trap of false promises from false gods. Stay true to me, because in all of this, I have a purpose for your lives as the people of God, and a purpose that you can't possibly imagine or understand on your own. And so Moses does all of these things, and after he's all done, he takes the 2 tablets, and he comes down the mountain, and he comes to the people, and he doesn't notice it because, he's not looking in a mirror, he can't see what's going on, but he sees that his face is glowing. And the people see the tablets, and they know that he's been talking to God, and his face is shining, and they are afraid. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly why they're afraid, but I have a pretty good guess. Because, you see, this isn't the first time that Moses has brought tablets down to the people with the commandments on it. This is the second time. The first time he's up there, he fashions the tablets, God writes the law on the tablets, the 10 Commandments, the covenant promise, and he has this plan for these people. And while all that's happening up on the mountain with Moses and God, the people are down below gathering up their gold, melting it down, because they believe now, they're afraid, they don't know why they're out there, they're not sure where it's going, they're having a Jim Lovell moment, and they decide that the way out of this mess is through precious metals, fashioned into something that they can worship. And so Moses comes down. He sees what's going on. He tosses the commandments down on the ground. They shatter into pieces. And it's a symbol of the way that these people have broken their promise with God, even before they get to see God's end of the promise, before they get to see the commandments, before they get to see the covenant, and before they get to see the purpose that God has for their lives. And that's what happens the first time. And now, here we are, chapter 34. It's playing itself out all over again. Moses is up on the mountain talking with God. He comes down. He brings the tablets. His face is shining. They know that he's been talking to the God that they have been faithless to, that they have abandoned. And I think that's why they're afraid. But you know, here's the thing. God already knows what's going on. He knows that they've been faithless. He knows that they've done these things. He knows that they have melted down gold and that they have taken a path that is not taking them in a direction that he wants them to go, that a plan that he has for them, but takes them far away from him. He knows all of that. And still, he brings Moses up onto the mountain in chapter 34. He says, fashion the tablets. I will rewrite my law, and they will be my people. And he says, you know, don't make treaties. Don't fall into false promises, because it says in the middle of 34, it says, because I have a purpose for you. Not for you as you ought to be, faithful and true, but for you as you are. People who are wayward and wandering and faithless and afraid. And you'll notice, he doesn't go down there himself. He sends Moses. A simple, ordinary, fallible, sinful human being. And yes, his face is shining with the glory and radiance of God. And yes, it makes the people afraid. But Moses covers that glory with a veil, so that person to person, human to human, God's will be known among them. See, this is God's MO. This is how he works in the world. He hides his glory from our eyes. He hides his faithfulness. He hides the truth of his righteousness. He veils it. But the glory is still there. It's hidden. It's hidden in a human being named Moses. It's not the last time he's going to do this. He comes later as a human being, as weakness, as suffering, as an innocent one who has taken on the veil of the cross. And all of that glory and all of that power of God hides beneath weakness and helplessness and trial and trouble. Because you see, all that power of God, all that glory, that's not the real power. That's not what he wants them to take home. That's not the core of the purpose. The real power is the power of love. If you remember right from last week, we were talking about Monsters, Inc., another movie, right? And Sully, who his purpose in life is to scare children, and he's the best at it of anybody, all of a sudden falls in love with a child who he calls Boo. And the child doesn't see him as a scary monster. The child sees Sully as Kitty. And he so falls in love that he forgets about his purpose in scaring children, and a new purpose emerges. He is drawn to the one who is helpless. And that's what God does for us. It's what he does in the cross, because he knows that the greatest motivating, powerful force on earth is when you and I fall in love with someone who is in need. And there we begin to discover who we are. And there we begin to discover our purpose as people of God. Let's sing. So you never know what events are going to transpire that are going to bring you home. And sometimes those events look like obstacles, but those obstacles are instead used for a greater purpose. They become the doorways and the passageways to a life of purpose and meaning. Not too long ago, I heard a story about a church in this area, not here in Algona, but in the area, in the region. And this church was a small congregation. They were struggling, just trying to make ends meet. The pastor was busy making sure, and the church was busy making sure that the small membership of the small church was being properly serviced. And one day, the pastor, something was bothering him. He couldn't quite figure it out. But he stood up in a sermon, and he said, you know, I just want you to think about this, because this has been on my heart. He said, if all of a sudden our congregation were to just disappear, would anyone in the community notice? And he just left them with that question, and pretty soon the whole congregation is kind of struggling with that. And their church council gets together and they start talking about it a little bit more, and they said, you know, they would miss us because they really don't know that we're here now. We've been kind of focused on ourselves. And so they decided that they were going to adopt a grade school. And they went to the school, they talked to the principal, got it all worked out. And so every month, at one point in the month, the birthdays for that month, they get together in a room, they have a cake or a cookie or something sugar to send them back to their classroom with, and they sing happy birthday. And they have developed a system that's like a clothing bank. And they have a food bank. And teachers, you're going to love this. The teachers don't buy supplies at the school because the congregation provides all the supplies that they need. Not out of your pocket anymore, because they've adopted these people. And then they do some mentoring, which sounds like a big fancy word where you set a child down and say, how are you doing, son? I know that you have lots of trouble at home. It's not that at all. You know what mentoring is? You sit down side by side with a child, and you color on your paper, and he or she colors on his or her paper. And pretty soon, as you're coloring together, conversation starts, and hearts meet. And I just find it so interesting. You know, there's no data to know whether or not this is making a difference, except the people in the school see that there's a difference. Some of those kids go to their church now. Some of the teachers go to that church. But that's not the reason they're doing it. The reason they're doing it is because they have fallen in love with a man who came to them veiled in the weakness and suffering of the cross. And he came not for what they ought to be, but for what they are. That man sees them in their sin and loves them so much that he stretched out his arms and became weakness and suffering and sin on their behalf. And then they took those obstacles in their lives, that sin, that trial, those shortcomings, all of those things that make them so fallible, and they went into a school where there are all kinds of people who are dealing with weakness and fallibility, and they reached out with the love of Jesus. And here's the really interesting thing, because as it says in Matthew 25, when did I see you naked and hungry? When did I see you in prison and in want? And Jesus said, when you did these things to the least of them, you were meeting me. And all of a sudden, life twists with new purpose. A purpose that they'd never experienced before. You know, sounds a little bit like First Lutheran Church, doesn't it? Small congregation, struggling to survive, feeding our own. Would anyone notice if all of a sudden we just dropped off of Algona? I don't want to lead you into an answer, but I'd like you to think about that question. Think about who you are as an individual. Think about who we are as a congregation. And you might say, well, you know, I don't have any gifts. What could I do? But see, that's the beauty of it. Because all of those things that you see as obstacles to a life of purpose are tools in God's hands. And he will use those tools to reach someone else who is lost and alone and hurting. Maybe your obstacle is being lost, alone, and hurting. Maybe you're trying to find meaning. Maybe you're trying to discover a life of purpose. And you will find it in someone who is struggling with exactly the same thing. So you see, you never know what events might transpire to bring you home. It is an Exodus road, a journey from a life with no purpose to a life and a kingdom of hope and wonder and the glory of God veiled in the ordinary and the everyday. Amen.